спикеру следующей панельной сессии «Мировые рынки капитала в переходном периоде». Выпала честь представить наших спикеров. Но прежде я назову себя. Жамишев Булат, министр финансов Казахстана. Ну и у нас сегодня на этой панельной сессии два спикера. Господин Лемьер, я думаю, не надо его представлять, ныне советник председателя BNP Paribas и президент Европейского банка реконструкции и развития 2000 по 2008 год. И господин Костелли, старший стратег UBS Global Asset Management. Тема нашей панельной сессии по сути является продолжением предыдущей панельной сессии. И прежде чем предоставить слово нашим спикерам, я хотел бы, пользуясь своим правом модератора, попытаться обозначить некоторые вопросы, которые изначально предполагалось включить в качестве для обсуждения на этой панельной сессии. После мирового экономического кризиса лидеры многих стран все чаще поднимают вопросы реформирования системы управления мировой экономикой. И в этом свете актуальным является решением становится разработка единого антикризисного плана для обеспечения долгосрочного экономического роста на основе предложений, выработанных на этой конференции. Но с утра вы на утренней сессии, на открытии вы слышали слова доктора Манделла о том, что Бреттон-Вудский институт требует существенной модернизации, и он сказал о том, что возлагает надежды в этой части на большую двадцатку. По прогнозам Международного валютного фонда, в 2013 году рост реального ВВП составит 3,3%, в 2012 году рост мирового ВВП сложился на уровне 3,2%, в том числе в странах ОСР 1,4%, в США 2,3%, в странах еврозоны произошло снижение ВВП на 0,4%. Замедление мировой экономики привели к ослаблению внешнего спроса на сырье и торможению роста ВВП в Казахстане, если говорить о нашей стране. Но в качестве антикризисных мер в течение последних лет многие страны применяли фискальную политику, направленную на недопущение банкротства банков и стимулирование экономического развития, превратившись в активных заемщиков на рынке судных капиталов. Многие развитые страны опять закрыли 2012 год с дефицитом бюджета, с увеличившимся дефицитом бюджета, и это значит, что продолжился рост долгов ведущих развитых стран, без этого уже достигших значительных размеров. Например, в прошлом году госдолг Италии составил 1,9 триллиона евро, 121% к ВВП, Португалии 184 миллиарда, 108% к ВВП, США 15 триллионов долларов США, 100% к ВВП, Франции 1,7 триллиона евро, 86% к ВВП. Глобальный экономический кризис показал, что критерий госдолг не выше 60% к ВВП по Маастрихтскому договору. Но получается, что или не соблюдается, или устарел. По этому поводу хотелось бы услышать мнение спикеров даже для стран Евросоюза. Например, если США справляются с выполнением обязательств по своевременному обслуживанию и погашению долга при госдолге выше 100%, то в некоторых странах уровень госдолга ниже этого критерия приводил к серьезным проблемам по выполнению своих долговых обязательств. По мнению аналитиков, проблема суверенных долгов останется на рынке в течение долгого времени и может в любое время вызвать новый финансовый кризис. Ну и в этой связи я хотел бы обратиться к господину Лемьеру, высказать свое мнение по данному вопросу. Неопределенности и риски вследствие низких темпов экономического роста на фоне долгового кризиса Европы существенно влияет на конъюнктуру мировых рынков капитала. В сентябре 2012 года Европейский центральный банк запустил программу ОМТ, в рамках которой Европейский центральный банк может выкупать облигации стран еврозоны без ограничения объемов покупки для контроля уровня рыночных ставок. В результате принятых мер цена облигаций проблемных стран стала расти, а доходность существенно падать, снизившись до конца года по десятилетним облигациям Италии и Ирландии до 4%, Испании 5%, Португалии 6%. В целом улучшились ликвидность и условия заимствования на рынках капитала, что отразилось на увеличении объема выпуска долговых обязательств. Несмотря на позитивное воздействие на рынки капитала, важно контролировать такие возникающие негативные эффекты, как некорректная оценка кредитного риска, чрезмерные потоки капитала в страны с формирующимися рынками, а также увеличение внешнего долга из-за низкой стоимости заимствования. И следует при этом отметить, что международная экономика все-таки как некую констатацию подвержена беспрецедентному росту денежной массы ключевых мировых валют, что вызывает озабоченность по поводу возможных негативных последствий. Существенные вмешательства в основные рынки капитала посредством денежных операций могут искажать ценообразование на рынках капитала. И также я, господин Лемьер, хотел бы попросить вас высказаться относительно данного вопроса. Ну и поскольку меня в кулуарах данного форума спрашивали, что вы думаете по поводу будущей динамики стоимости заимствований на международных рынках капитала, я, пользуясь случаем, также переадресую этот вопрос нашему уважаемому спикеру. Неопределенности и риски вследствие низких темпов экономического роста на фоне долгового кризиса Европы существенно влияют на конъюнктуру мировых рынков капитала. В сентябре, стимулирующая денежно-кредитная политика, включая нулевые ставки и количественное смягчение, масштабный выкуп ипотечных облигаций и гособлигаций, активно проводимая США, Великобританией, Японией и другими странами, продолжает поддерживать совокупный спрос на активы. В целях стимулирования экономического роста за последние 4 года Федеральная резервная система скупила на рынке облигации на сумму $2,4 триллиона США. Остается открытым вопрос, каким последствиям для США и всей мировой системы может привести столь резкий рост монетарной базы доллара. Ну, этот вопрос я просил бы затронуть в своем выступлении господина Кастелли. Ну и говоря о тенденциях на мировом рынке капитала, нельзя не остановиться на оценке влияния развивающихся стран на этот рынок. Возрастающее значение Китая и других развивающихся стран означает, что их высокая доля в мировой экономике должна ставить их в ряд системно значащих стран на рынке капитала. Реализация этого условия на практике будет означать появление новых рисков, которые требуют своего осмысления, нахождения оптимальных вариантов их разрешения. И хотелось бы услышать мнение наших спикеров относительно того, каким должен быть процесс интеграции развивающихся стран в мировой рынок капитала. Ну и картина мирового рынка капитала не будет, наверное, полной, если мы не обсудим перспективы развития местных рынков облигаций в национальной валюте. Этот вопрос очень интересен для казахстанской аудитории или в частности, и хотелось бы также услышать мнение наших уважаемых спикеров. Поэтому я больше не буду занимать ваше мнение и предоставлю слово нашим спикерам. Господин Лемьер, пожалуйста, вам слово.
Minister, thank you for your opening remarks. I must say that you have raised good and difficult questions at a very late hour in the day. So I'll try to be brief, to make a few points. I'm sure each of us, we have dinners and meetings, so let us focus on the key questions. Well, the crisis has certainly created a new paradigm, which is the need to adjust. I think all of us, we understand this. And it is incredibly difficult to adjust and to change policies which have been put in place 30 years ago. And adjustment creates all the tensions you have mentioned, Minister. They are unavoidable. Let's focus maybe quickly on Europe. Europe has gone a long way on debt, like in the US, like in Japan. We have been living too much on debt. Or in fact, we have thought that we could grow and create income in the future in such a way that we could pay back the debt. And the European, at least the Eurozone, have created the most efficient, great tool in modern economic history, which is the euro. The euro is an incredibly efficient tool. The use of it was not great, but the tool is good. Why it is good? Because it has created a unified monetary zone among one of the wealthiest zones in Europe. It has boosted trade and investment, and it has given cheap money to many economies. So once more, euro is extremely efficient. I've never shared the view of many who have said that there could be a breakup or exit. It doesn't make sense. Those who have said this do not know Europe. And I can understand they say this because they don't know Europe, but welcome, come and you will understand. And the euro has a great future. Now, there was a point which was wrong. The wrong point is that cheap money creates sloppy policies. And some sloppy policies have been implemented in some countries. Maybe by policymakers, but also by the private sector. And we need to acknowledge that if some policies did go wrong, the risk management of the banks and the funds were not good. How is it that we have invested so much money on the tiny docks of Dublin? How is it we have invested so much money on the coast of Spain? It is a shared responsibility. And I think this is the first lesson of the crisis. In the modern world, you cannot blame anybody, but you must make sure that the system works well. So this is being fixed. And I go back to your question, Minister, it has an impact because fixing this, and this is the European choice, is to try to address both the debt question and by fiscal consolidation and by making structural reforms to boost growth. Difficult, challenging, this is the hard way, and it is very difficult to fine-tune these type of policies. It has created questions, uncertainties, but I think the commitments of the governments and the commitment of the ECB are absolutely clear and outstanding. So it will take time, and for the time being growth is low, but that will be done. Now you have a second question behind this, which is the banking sector. The banking sector in the crisis everywhere in the world, in the US or in Europe, was over-leveraged. Why? Because bankers have tried to be efficient by using money or borrowed money to make the best use of their capital and fund the economy. Many banks have gone too far. They were too much leveraged. So the first impact of the crisis was to move to new regulations. And these regulations have had two impacts. The first one is to improve the solvency ratios, more equity, more capital. And how do you increase your capital ratio? You may raise equity, not easy. What you do is you deleverage. You reduce the volume of lending to the real economy. But the second impact was to bring, after some crisis, especially in the UK, to increase, to create and to toughen the liquidity ratio. And this is very new. Through these two movements, you have a clear impact. One is deleveraging, the part of the global economy which is going to be financed through the banks, the books of the banks, is reduced. That's for sure. And I could be long on this, but dinners. So let's be brief. And the second point is about liquidity. Regulators today look a lot at the liquidity ratios. And it has a clear impact, which is fragmentation. The cause, or one of the impacts of the crisis in the banking sector is fragmentation. And we have to be much aware of this and try to fight against fragmentation. But a second impact is massive preference to deposits. The winners of tomorrow are the banks which are able to raise deposits and liquidity. And this is new. And it does change the banking model very quickly. And it will have a big impact on developing countries. If you put the two together, fragmentation and liquidity, you understand that there are two consequences. The first one is there will be a tougher choice between funding the sovereign states and funding the real economy. The decision made by regulators, I welcome, is to say that they should delink the states and the banking sector, and they should reduce the portion of funding to the states brought by the banks. This is a major change all over the world, especially in Europe, but all over the world, it is a major change. In many countries, many banks prefer to fund the states rather than taking the risk of funding the real economy. And regulators will push very hard to avoid this. The second point is the key importance of the funding in the domestic currency. And I will take two examples of this. One is about Europe. The Eurozone is fragmented with 17 regulators. Regulators tend to look at their liquidity in their remit. At a time in a zone, there should be free allocation of liquidity according to efficiency standards. This is the reason why you see these days a key move in the Eurozone, which is banking union and the creation of an integrated, united supervisor at the ECB level to avoid the fragmentation within the Eurozone. This is absolutely key for the future. The second point is the key importance of growing domestic market, capital market, in domestic currencies. We see this in many countries. I see it in Turkey. I see it in Russia. I know Kazakhstan is working on this. It is crucial to mobilize domestic savings in local currency to fund the real economy and avoid the terrible risk many have been taking in the past, funding their mortgage in Swiss franc, Japanese yen, or dollar, but to do it in domestic currency, not shifting the currency risk to the end borrower. So I would like, and that will be my final remark, to raise a question. The question is what we call the shadow banking. Banks are more and more regulated. Banks, hopefully, will be safer, hopefully, and will not be a risk for the taxpayers and the countries. But just outside the banking sector, we see growing what we call shadow banking, investment funds. Of course, they are welcomed. They are incredibly important in the system, but they are not regulated. And to take one of your points, Minister, they live in a totally new environment of very cheap money. I have never seen over the 30 or 40 last years so cheap money coming through quantitative easing from the US, the UK, or Japan. And I must say that the recent decision of the Bank of Japan, which I respect and I hope they will succeed, because that will be crucial for growth in the world, but implementing their policies, which hopefully will be good, they create very cheap liquidity. And we know that cheap liquidity has an impact, which is the creation of bubbles. So, from a crisis in which banks were weakened, have created tensions, probably have taken a too large part in the funding of the real economy, we are shifting to much safer banks, but at the same time, a shadow banking sector growing in a risky environment because money is cheap. So we see that we are not at the end of the story. We see that banks, regulators, managers of the shadow banking institutions, governments will continue to have a key responsibility working together and addressing these challenges. So we have made a step. It is not over. And it's going to be difficult because for the time being, there's no growth, or growth is flat. Because unfortunately, I fear that prices of many commodities will fall. So yes, I think we have done and we are doing a very good job on the banking sector, much better, much safer, but risks are elsewhere today. This is life. We have to live with this, we have to be aware, and we have to address these challenges in a very open way. And forum like this one tonight does help a lot to understand this type of questions. Thank you for listening.
Большое спасибо, господин Лемьер. Следующий докладчик, господин Костелли, пожалуйста.
Thank you very much. I will also be very brief. I'm the last obstacle to your dinner, so I know that I risk taking too much of your time. I would like immediately to tackle the question raised by the Minister, and I believe overall it is how the financial landscape will evolve. In order to answer this question, you need to look back actually where we are coming from. So let me do very briefly. Some of the issues have already been touched, but if you look at the years preceding the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, what sometimes is referred to as financial debt was growing at something like 8-9%. Financial debt basically is the overall amount of assets that you see across the economy, within domestic economies and cross-border. Basically, we move from a very low level in the 80s to a very high level in 2007. When the financial crisis hit, actually this process, I don't want to say that it went into reverse, but it slowed down significantly. And now in terms of growth rate, since 2008, we are at around 2% per year. So this means that in nominal terms, and as a percentage, or better as a percentage of GDP, financial debt basically decreased by something like 40%. So if you exclude the impact of the rise in debt, which has partly compensated the drop, the overall drop in the non-government debt, excluding government debt, will be around 50%. So actually, we move really to a new paradigm, as my previous speaker just said. Now, the question is where the growth was coming from the previous, from the pre-crisis periods. The two main elements, one of them has already been touched today, and actually was on the positive side, European integration. The European integration in terms of growth of financial debt has been a very powerful motor. And this, because of course, following the introduction of the euro, both from a funding and from a lending perspective, it's been much easier to lend money cross-border. The second one has been also touched by my previous speaker, in a nutshell, is leverage in the banking sector. The banking sector clearly grew beyond what we have been observing in the real economy, and this created, of course, as a consequence, which until the financial crisis was considered as a positive development, an incredible amount of lending in the overall economy. These two factors, basically, are the one which went into reverse since 2007. Actually, financial deepening and cross-border flows within the euro area has reversed. So basically, the financial integration process, which has been at the heart of the euro project, went into reverse. And the main reason, has already been touched by previous speakers, has mostly been the fact that banks, when they have to choose where to deleverage, they choose to do that outside the border. And the reason is that pressure from shareholders, but I would say also from regulator and from, of course, a politician who have an interest in pushing the banks to support the domestic economy, they put pressure in particularly on cutting on foreign activities. Now, this last reason was also the cutting on foreign activities, why we saw a dramatic drop in cross-border capital flows. Actually, the drop has been pretty dramatic, about 60% from the peak in 2007. And the two main drivers, as I already mentioned, the banking lending, which was and is still a big chunk of cross-border capital flows, and the second one, once again, European integration. The only positive, if I can say that, is that within this picture, while emerging markets have not been immune from the slowdown in financial debt, because even within emerging markets, banks still are the largest provider of funding for the corporate sector, is that in terms of cross-border capital flow, actually they've been pretty resilient in the sense that already now we are approaching the pre-crisis level. And this is, of course, a very important factor on which I want to touch upon at the end of my remarks. So how will evolve? I believe that there is a certain degree of overshooting within the banking sector. I mean, I work in a bank, and I can see that the process of adaptation of the banking sector to new regulation, to the new economic environment, in particular the lower level of leverage and the higher degree of capital, and also to select what type of activities, has probably brought banks to overreact in order to build up, to strengthen their position very fast. This process is still underway, but you can already see some sign, in particular in the US, where banks appear to already found a new equilibrium in this new environment. And I believe this process, when completed across other parts of the world, will eventually brought some more capital, made more capital available for lending. So that's the first one. The second one is the future of the euro. If I look at that factor, and based on also what I heard since this morning, I don't see the European integration process, I'm talking about the financial integration process, to eventually reaccelerate anytime soon. Simply because while in the short term the focus of the debate is on austerity measure, we don't see yet those change, in particular in the fiscal area, in the political area, banking union has also been mentioned during today, which will eventually move Europe to another more harmonious and sustainable growth path, which is required in order to restart the financial integration process. The second one is that banks are adapting to the new regulatory environment, but we also have to be aware that still this process, from a regulatory point of view, has not been finalized. There are still many question marks out there, and you can see from time to time the conflict arising within different regions and countries The best example probably is about capital of subsidiaries that has been emerging in the last few weeks between US and Europe. So, but I think what is really missing from the current debate on the finalization of the regulation for banks is actually that spirit of cooperation which came into the picture in the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis. There was a clear call from all the countries to coordinate their policy response, and actually I believe it was successful in avoiding what at the time looked like a total financial meltdown. That spirit probably is now missing, and you can already see different countries and different regulator and policymakers moving towards a different direction. So the role of banks in restarting the process of financial deepening will depend very much also on regulators and policymakers to eventually strike the right balance between the need of making the system more safe, but at the same time do not fall in the trap of what I would define financial protectionism. So we are at emerging markets. Emerging market, as I said, has been more resilient from an economic and financial point of view. At the same time, financial markets has also show, I would say, and I heard that that's part of my profession, I work mainly with sovereign clients, sovereign wealth funds and central banks. You can see how emerging markets have been responsive to the financial crisis in 2008 because they were coming from a much stronger macroeconomic framework, more accumulated foreign exchange reserve, better fiscal fundamentals. When you face a crash and your motor is working at full power, it's much easier to eventually decelerate or accelerate depending on the needs imposed by the external environment. And that's, I think, is a remarkable improvement. In this sense, emerging markets actually are already in the process of being integrated into the global financial system. Let me give an example, which is also very much related to what I hear from many of our investors. The bond markets. Currently, there is a growing demand for getting exposure to emerging market bonds. This is true for both emerging markets bonds in hard currency, but it's also true and growing for emerging market bonds in local currency. Now, this is something relatively new because, as you might remember, over the last few decades, emerging markets from a counterparty risk point of view in terms of credit risk, they were considered relatively risky. This mindset is changing. We are now seeing a reassessment of what we used to call the risk-free assets. What is more risky? Buying a bond issued by the Italian government with negative growth and rising debt, or of an emerging market which has just been upgraded to investment grade? And I think this type of questions are starting to rise in the mind of the investor, and we are seeing a growing share of portfolio of, in particular, institutional investor moving into this space. What about the role of foreign exchange reserves? I think that's a very important point because although these investors are often perceived as the holder of a sort of a safe, of a buffer of capital which can only be deployed when eventually something happens or an accident or a macroeconomic event require the intervention of the government, we are also starting to see a growing debate within the sovereign space regarding the use of foreign exchange reserve, which in many economies, in particular in emerging markets, which are the largest holder of foreign exchange reserve, have grown beyond what is the level considered adequate for monetary purpose. So actually, in the previous example I made about emerging market bonds and in local currency, we are seeing that many sovereign central banks are considering diversification in that space. Once again, why? The majority of foreign exchange reserves are still invested basically in dollar, euro, Japanese yen, and a few other advanced economies currency. Unfortunately, the IMF does not disclose the exact amount, puts all the currency which are not the major one into something called overs, which include quite a few advanced economies and probably a few emerging markets. But I suspect that overall, the counter level of exposure of central banks to emerging markets currency probably is no higher than 1 or 2% overall. Now, if you look at instead at the change in the economic landscape, at the importance that emerging markets have acquired I don't want to use the usual GDP growth share, which is very important, but simply also in terms of flow of investments, cross-border activities. I mean, cross-border capital flow from emerging market used to be a tiny percentage of the total. Now we are already at 25% of the total. There is no doubt that there is a need for a change in the way foreign exchange reserves are invested across different currencies to facilitate the process of integration of emerging markets into global financial market. This requires a lot of efforts, and like what I see, for instance, happening in China is very promising with the rapid internationalization of the RMB. When I started this job, the internalization of RMB was considered something really distant in the future, like decades away. Now I start hearing that the RMB might become an official reserve currency, official in the sense that it is adopted by central banks and it's reflected in the statistics, probably by the end of this decade, which is actually not too far away if you think about it, because we're talking about another 5 or 6 years. So all this change has to be facilitated. And I would like to conclude with 2 remarks. The first one is something that I see that relate to the way financial market works. And in particular, because there is this idea that only the funding of the real economy is very important, but I also see other effects of this change in the global financial landscape which should be adequately addressed. The first one is about the liquidity in markets. I'll give you an example. Corporate bond market, and in the declaration which has been put together, I can see that the corporate bond market is expected to play a bigger role, because actually it is already playing a bigger role as a result of the financial crisis and the acceleration in disintermediation. But if you look, for instance, at the US corporate bond market, we are actually seeing an increase in transaction costs and a drop in liquidity, which creates some serious risk going forward, because the corporate bond market has been doing remarkably well over the last few years since the financial crisis because of this increase in disintermediation. But of course, accident can always happen, and this can create a situation where the rapid development of the corporate bond market in both advanced economies, in particular in Europe, but also in emerging markets, will eventually slow down. So that's very important. And this links me to the final remark I would like to make, which is actually about the role of what is called shadow banking. I only partly agree on the remarks made by the previous speakers. And I say that because what disintermediation basically is about, moving a part of the funding of the real economy, or a growing share of the real economy, outside the banks to something else. And here we are seeing disintermediation is actually broader than just developing the corporate bond market. We are seeing, for instance, asset managers, which according to some fall within the scope of shadow banking, because independent asset managers which are not part of banks are actually, according to the European Commission, part of shadow banking, so as to be regulated in the same way as banks are regulated, actually moving into the lending scape, into the lending business. So we are seeing many asset managers starting to lend to corporates. We are seeing asset manager moving into the real estate lending. And what I call, so disintermediation is also about allowing over investors, which are actually the one with a lot of liquidity, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, endowment funds, insurance funds, which actually hold the majority of the assets, to eventually move into this space. This, of course, requires regulation, but I think in the definition of shadow banking, we should be very careful about what we plug into this huge pocket of, which include, of course, hedge funds, of course, very, if you want, speculative type of institution, but also a lot of institutions which actually manage of pensioners and savers. And that's the end of my remarks. Thank you very much.
Благодарю, господин Костелли. А теперь хотелось предложить участникам данной панельной сессии задать вопросы, если таковые есть. Пожалуйста. Вопросов, по-моему, нет, поэтому позвольте от вашего имени поблагодарить наших спикеров, господина Лемьера, господина Костелли, за замечательные, очень содержательные доклады и на этом закончить нашу панельную сессию. Спасибо.